Yes, Natasha's nodding. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. And I know people will feed in as we go. Um, because we have a special guest, Mr. Friedman, I think unless Natasha, you feel we should do otherwise, I was thinking I could just quickly run through the attendance and put a check mark. Or you want to do that at the end?
That's fine, just to run through it quickly, and we could keep anything else that's business after he's presented.
Okay, that sounds good. Um, all right. Is Ashia Parker on? Senator Corey McCray, Delegate Stephanie Smith, Andy Smullian for Police Commissioner Harrison, Shantae Jackson for Muncie, Nikki Thompson or Aaron DeGraff. Oh, hey, Nikki, great. I see Aaron DeGraffenreid as well.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. City Solicitor Jim Shea. Anyone from the Civilian Review Board? I see Bobby Cherry.
Yeah, good afternoon, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Natasha.
Good afternoon. Lisa Robinson or anyone from the Vanguard Justice Society? Mark Washington. Ray Kelly.
I don't know if he's unable to unmute, but I do see him in the
Oh, I
participants.
do. Yep. I see his name. Ray Kelly. Kaylin Young.
Present, everybody. How you doing?
Great. Trey Murphy. Lydia Walther Rodriguez. Tyler Adamson.
Here.
Great. Thanks for being here, Tyler. Natasha here. Adam Abadir.
Greetings, everyone.
Right. And is there anyone from the law department? I see Marielle Shatinia, Lauren Perez, and Haley Tilt. Welcome back, Haley. Is there anyone on from the local control or staffing local control whose name I haven't mentioned?
I do see that Delegate Smith has joined.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Hello.
Hello, Delegate Smith. All right, and we still do not have Ashia Parker.
Good afternoon,
Right.
everybody. I'm here.
Oh, great. Hi, Ashia.
Hi.
All right, so we are gathered. As you all know, we normally meet on Fridays at 10 a.m. or 11, and then we've been having our midday meetings, special meetings on Tuesdays. Thank you, everyone, for being here today on a Monday, no less, in August. We're especially gathered today to welcome and thank Barry Friedman for agreeing to meet with us and to talk a little bit about the Chicago story. I don't know if you can see yourself on camera, Barry, but it looks like your head is about to be gobbled up by the jaws of life there behind you. And I don't know whether this was a child's art or not, but we promise we're not going to gobble you up today. We're a very friendly group, and we're anxious to hear what's happening in Chicago.
I'm really glad to be here, and I want to thank you all for listening to me and for being so kind as to let me do this on a Monday. That was my young son's idea of what a T-Rex looked like. So that's what's about to gobble up my head. If while we're talking, folks get the ability to turn on their cameras, I always love to see who I'm talking with, but I understand that we can't all at this time. I want to tell you a little bit about the policing project that I run and the work that we've done both in Baltimore and in Chicago. And then I'm going to open myself to any and all questions that you have. As you're about to see, the kinds of things you're grappling with are really at the heart of everything we do. So I'm a law professor at NYU Law School. I teach constitutional law. I teach criminal procedure, which is the law of policing. I've done that for more decades than I'd like to admit. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I started the Policing Project, which is a not-for-profit center here. And we work as a center to improve policing along 4 particular dimensions: democratic accountability, which I want to talk a lot about today; transparency, which I also want to talk about; equity and equitable. We want policing to be equitable, particularly racial equity. So that's important today as well. And we want it to be effective. You know, a lot of money gets spent on policing, and public safety matters enormously to people, and we want it to be effective. I want to stress at the outset that we work with all stakeholders. So everywhere we work, we have worked with mayors' offices, police departments, communities impacted by policing, technology companies, local activists and advocates. It's our view that the more people you can bring to the table and find some agreement, the faster you can effect change, and that is our goal. We did a project in Baltimore. We were asked to audit the aerial surveillance program that you all, I'm sure, are familiar with. Some people colloquially called it the spy plane. And our report, I think, ultimately had some impact on the decision of the federal court to declare it unconstitutional. But more important for present purposes, we devote the end of that report to discussing the fact that the city of Baltimore's police department was under control of the state legislature, and that we felt that that was deeply and profoundly inappropriate as a matter of democratic accountability. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be here because this is change that we thought needed to happen. And we have worked for a long time in Chicago, among other places. I'm going to mention what we did in Chicago, but then I want to give you what I think is the most important insight that I can give you, and then maybe 2 or 3 others. So in Chicago, we presently work with the mayor's office, individuals and organizations in impacted communities, communities impacted by policing, the police department, on a multi-million-dollar, several-year attempt to put in place neighborhood policing that gives the community voice in how it is actually policed and how public safety problems are dealt with. As part of that work, we long ago partnered with the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, which was an alliance, a group of any number of smaller or larger advocate and activist organizations that were charged with coming up with oversight for the Chicago Police Department. And we were drafters or co-drafters with them of a bill that was passed by the Chicago City Council to create a community commission for public safety and accountability. And so that's the kind of thing I think you're thinking about. And I'll talk about commissions versus inspectors general and city council control and all of that. We thought through all that. And I'm going to urge you to talk with Nicole Jordan McBride, who couldn't be here today, but Nicole is our director of advocacy. And we met actually through that original work with the GAPA group. And then the co-founder of the Policing Project is a woman by the name of Maria Ponomarenko, who teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. And Maria has written extensively about the issues that you're interested in and helped with the drafting of that statute. And I talked with her a bunch before coming here today. So she's another font of expertise on all of this. I'm going to pause to make sure that that's all straight. And then I actually want to offer some insights to you. Is there anything you want from me, the chairs want from me before I go forward?
No, I think this is a good overview. You know, back to the picture, just let your son know that it's been well received here in Baltimore. Very much appreciate his creativity. It's awesome. But also I really appreciate having your background and your experience with Baltimore, just to level set and in the spirit of disclosures, full. I served as the acting city solicitor during the time that the aerial surveillance program was being litigated in the Fourth Circuit. So just lay that on the table for just for experiential value, and you know, your awareness of sort of our shared experience there, obviously from different perspective. We're very interested in talking to as many people as we can to get as much information as we can as we move forward in this effort to understand the moment that Baltimore is in and the great opportunity that we are presented with. We're making great progress. My co-chair is Ashia Parker, who is really leading the community outreach effort aspect of getting the charter amendment pushed through and voted on in November. We're starting with a community outreach program when I guess that's 22 Thursday night, August 25th. So we're rocking and rolling. But even as we're rocking and rolling and getting out the messaging about the small charter amendment, we're doing a lot of work to understand when the next step happens that we're making good recommendations for Baltimore. So just we all thank you for the time.
Pleasure to
you've
be
given us.
here, and I knew about your role in the law department. I want to start with one really big insight. It's the thing I'm most passionate about and that I think is maybe most important, and certainly was the most influential in Chicago itself. And then I'm going to move from that to some subsidiary points to give an overview, but then actually invite you to share with me some of the things you're thinking, and maybe we can puzzle through them. So the way I got into all of this work was a light bulb that went off in my head in 2006 about accountability in policing. And I wrote a book called Unwarranted Policing Without Permission. And in that book, I talk about something called democratic policing. But I actually think the best way to understand what I want to talk about is to distinguish between back end and front end accountability. So we hear the word accountability all the time in policing. I'm sure your group talks about accountability. And when people talk about accountability in the area of policing, what they usually mean is that something has gone badly, something has gone off the rails, and people want to hold somebody responsible. We have lots of mechanisms in policing to do that. Civil rights suits, civilian review boards, Department of Justice investigations and consent decrees, as you all know quite well. Even body cameras are an attempt to actually be able to identify who's responsible for something going wrong. And again, I call that back-end accountability. But what struck me in 2006, kind of as a constitutional law professor, but also a criminal procedure professor, is what we don't have around policing is front-end accountability. And I've come to believe that that's the biggest problem with policing today. So what do I mean by front-end accountability? Well, many of you are in or have extensive experience with government. And you know that in government, when we talk about accountability, we don't usually mean first and foremost holding some particular individual responsible because something went wrong. We mean setting rules and protocols and procedures and policies through legislation or administrative regulation or whatever it is that tells administrative agencies and people who work for the government what they are supposed to do. And that's so one thing we don't do around policing.
Oh, I told you I could.
Okay, so at this point, going to ask everybody to mute themselves. We're getting some conversations slipping through. All right, sorry, Mr. Friedman.
No, not to worry. And so that lack of front-end accountability around policing is, in my view, hugely responsible for many of the problems that we see in policing today. And if we fixed it, I think we would be in much better shape. And at the Policing Project, we actually write statutes for adoption by municipal entities or by state governments around things like use of force or pretextual automobile stops or transparency. So many of the kinds of things that you will be thinking about as a group and that any city needs to think about, we think there ought to be some sort of formal front-end guidance to the police to say what's expected of them. And that in the absence of that, we get a lot of the problems that we get in policing. And so the biggest thought I want to offer to you, and I hope you walk away with, is that whatever you do, you need some adequate way to create or ensure front-end accountability, not just back-end. I believe you have a civilian review board, but also front-end. Now, in terms of doing that, I'm just going to give you some pinprick thoughts, and then happy to hear what you're thinking about and puzzle through it with you. So, you know, what's tended to happen in the United States is that police departments end up being under the formal control of mayor's offices. And one of the things that I commend, at least as Haley explained it to me, is that you were thinking about not just doing that, but how to think and puzzle through what control ought to look like, whether it's from the city council or some other entity. And I think that's important because though it's very important for the mayor to have a certain degree of control over the police department. For example, I think it's appropriate for the mayor to have a large role in appointing the police commissioner and deciding whether to retain a police commissioner. The mayor is not always the most accountable or responsible for policy level decisions like whether to have aerial surveillance. That's just one example. And, you know, if you ask me where I place that authority, I'd probably tell you the city council, but there's a problem with city councils too, which is they're busy. Not everybody in the city council has time to be informed. And so, well, now you have a puzzle. You know, if it's not the mayor and it's not the city council, who is it? And in some small number of cities, they are adopting what my colleague Maria Ponomarenko calls regulatory intermediaries. And that's kind of a horrible jargon phrase, but what it refers to is things like police commissions or inspectors general. And I think that the cities that have some of the most evolved examples of that now are Los Angeles, for sure. It is, in my mind, the longest running, most successful example of a structure that that devolves some authority from the city council or the mayor onto another representative body to set policy for the police department. And also, I think Chicago's adopted a very, very interesting structure, and I'm proud that we had some hand in that, but I hardly will take all credit for it. And so I think you need to think through, you know, what are the kinds of issues that you confront, whether it's, you know, to adopt widespread electronic control of traffic with traffic cameras, or whether it's to have aerial surveillance and not, you know, to not be less than clear on this point. I think that gun violence is an unbelievable tragedy for the cities that suffer from it, and something needs to be done. The question is, what is the right answer? But those kind of policy questions, as opposed to day-to-day operational and tactical decisions, which have to remain with the police department, but the strategic and policy questions, are we going to have certain forms of surveillance? Are we going to have a particular use of force policy? Those are questions that I think do need front-end accountability. They need input from impacted communities and from the people in the jurisdiction. And the question is how to get that and integrate it. So I've probably talked too much, but let me stop there. And then I couldn't be more thrilled with two things. One is if you would pepper me with questions. And the other is, you know, if you're puzzling through particular things now, like who should hire and fire the police commissioner, or what should be the process for adopting a policy in the police department, you know, and wanted to share with me some of the things you're thinking, I'm also happy to react based on the experience that I've had.
Okay, thank you. In the past, I've sort of taken the lead with the questioning, and I don't need to continue that trend. So what I would prefer to do is to save my questions for the end and defer to others. So is there a member of the local control advisory board that wants to take the lead, or perhaps Natasha, because of your work with MOG as head of the Mayor's Office of Government Relations, would you like to start? I'm happy to step back for a couple of minutes and not be the lead.
Sure. So my question is, it's a little bit broad, but and thank you, Barry, but because you have such that academic background through the various cities, or at least some knowledge of it, I think one of the things that we are facing here is that right now the council does not have any say at all in policy. There's some policy that can be done at the state level, and certainly the mayor and the police commissioner, as the city is chartered, have significant power over the police department as well. So you mentioned just a couple of times of, those things we have to keep in mind when making the decision of what that change of control looks like. And you flagged that, for instance, in Los Angeles and Chicago, they went separate from, I guess, I don't know if you'd say it's unique or not, but that it's not really the mayor or the city council that does the work. But I'd imagine the vast majority of cities are somewhere in between where it's there's policy from the mayor, there's policy from the council, there's policy from the state. I guess if you could just kind of give a little bit more of an overview on that landscape. I know when Haley, as our summer fellow, was doing this research, it wasn't so cookie cutter. So it was, I know she was doing a lot of work to figure out what it looked like for various cities. But it seems like one of the things you're flagging is important is not just what the other cities are doing, but what is important for us to consider for our needs as we're looking to those other cities. I hope that wasn't a lot, but
No, Natasha,
Got
that's
the
great.
gist.
And I particularly like the for us to consider for our needs, because that's true. Every city's different in certain ways. And you really need to take that into account in terms of structuring, what's right for Baltimore. It's not, what's right for Baltimore is not going to be right for everywhere and vice versa. And cities vary widely. For example, New York, has a city council that does and has weighed in on policing matters, but then there's some areas that remain under state control. And so, partly state law determines some of this. And then in a situation that I take you to be in, though correct me if I'm wrong, where there's going to be a big shift and there's a lot of figuring out to do, you got to kind of figure out what works best for you. I do think mayors need to have substantial control. They are the chief executive of the city. If there are crime and public safety issues, they are the ones that get looked to address those. The problem, theoretically, and I mean this fully theoretically, this is no reflection on your mayor, and in fact, I think your mayor tilts away from the model I'm about to explain in the right ways. But because the mayor's incentive is to make a city safe, and very often re-election will turn on whether the city is perceived to be safe. The incentive is to enable the police department to do whatever the police department thinks needs to be done. And it's that set of incentives that, led New York to have hundreds and thousands of stops and frisks over a number of years, like really an extraordinary amount, with no showing that affected public safety. And what a city council has somewhat differently is the need to get elected by, particularly if they're not at-large council members, and I don't know enough about the Baltimore City Council, but by individual constituencies that may also bear the ill effects of certain aspects of policing, whether it's force or pretextual traffic stops or certain kinds of surveillance. And look, governance is got to involve compromise and accommodating different interests. And we could, I don't know if this is true, but we could adopt totalitarian measures and hope that we could keep cities perfectly safe, but nobody wants to live in a totalitarian regime. And on the other hand, we could, do everything we can to achieve perfect racial equity and perfect accommodation of our civil rights, but not be doing some things that we need to be doing to keeping a place safe. And so it's hard. Governing is hard. You all get that. And I think what you need to do is think for Baltimore. What is the way to accommodate the tensions in governance to make sure that you get the optimal kind of policing and public safety for the citizens of Baltimore? And I'll just say one other thing, even in places that have police commissions, by the way, I should stress the importance of inspectors general too, because I really think having a watchdog agency like that who can do investigations and write reports about things that are or not going well at a policy level to department are very important. And in LA, the IG's office reports directly to the police commission. In Chicago, it's an independent entity. But I'd encourage you to look at some models, because even in those places, it's not like the mayor doesn't have control or the city council doesn't have control. In any place that has a police commission, they do. But it's also sometimes hard for them to have control in the first instance. And the police commission or some body like that can be folks who are dedicated to focusing on those issues and dealing with them on a more day-to-day basis. The last thing I'll say, which was interesting for me to learn, is there are actually a lot of cities in the country that have police commissions. A lot of them in the Midwest. I mean, there's just some historical reason why that occurred. Many of them are not very effective. They exist, but the way the commission members are appointed, they tend to do whatever the police department wants. They don't exercise any oversight. They might not have any funding or entities that can actually do any kind of oversight. And by oversight, I mean not just back end, but front end. And I guess I want to stress that again, because good front end accountability can keep bad things from happening that you don't then have to worry about back end accountability. Anyway, I hope that was an answer.
Yeah, that was very helpful.
So before we go on to the next question, I just want to recognize some additional people that are on the call. Elena DePietro from the Law Department, Lisa Kelly from the Office of Equity and Civil Rights, Chief Kelly, Ben Guthorn from Legislative Reference, and Shantae Jackson, who's the director of MONSE. And I think that's everyone for now. Any other, anyone else with a question? I can't, yeah. My age old.
Bob Cherry has his hand raised.
Okay, Bob Cherry then.
Hey, good morning. I'm sorry, good afternoon, Professor. I apologize for not having my camera on. So my question actually is going to dovetail what you just mentioned about the police commission, sir. Early in the conversation, you mentioned Los Angeles, and you are correct in letting the board know that LA's had a commission for a long time. I'm close to Commissioner Bratton. I think Bill Bratton did a great job when he was out there. One of the things that he told me that he was successful at in not only navigating the consent decree, but in working with the gangs and with his, rank and file, especially post the riots of '92, was able to keep his cops working. And he was able to do a lot of that by instituting the reforms that the consent decree required. But he also mentioned that he was able to keep politics away from him. And he gave a lot of that credit to the police commission. Is that a model? Like, I know what you're saying. Baltimore is Baltimore, and we have to look what's best for us. We're obviously a much smaller town than either New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. I actually think a commission would work well here because it would bring in the city council. It would involve a lot of us across the city who live and work here. And just by way, I am a sworn law enforcement officer. I've been a BPD 29 years, most of my time in homicide. But I also live and vote here. So I hear what you're saying with the importance of not just putting the sole focus with the mayor, but with the city council and with the rest of us who live and want production from the police. But that's what we need in Baltimore. We are approaching 8 years of 300 plus murders. And Bratton was able to lower that in LA with that commission. What's your suggestion in terms of how that commission should be picked? And do you attribute some of Bill Bratton and the LA success to the removal of the politics and allowing the police to do the day-to-day tactics that we need to get done to fight crime?
Thanks for the question. It's a very good question, and it points to some, I think, similarities and differences in any given city, including Baltimore. I do think, Bill Bratton was very successful in LA and here in New York, and I think his instinct that you want to, in certain ways, depoliticize issues is wise, but it's also true that in some ways you want to politicize them. The trick is finding the right, I wish I could think of the metaphor here for you, but the right distance to move politics away from day-to-day operational activity. So, I've gone back to this issue of aerial surveillance, and I'm happy to go over it again, and I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody who wants to about the merits or demerits of aerial surveillance. Our report actually did not say either of those things. We weren't asked to, or pick anything you want. Like I have a lot of expertise in policing technologies and surveillance, but pick whatever the thing is you want. CCTV or whatever. At some level, policing can't be successful unless there's buy-in from the public. And on the other hand, the public can't run things every day. Like nothing works that way, right? Somebody's got to be in charge and do their jobs. And so I think, Mr. Cherry, your instinct there is right. That it's kind of like this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, this porridge is just right. You've just got to find that way to identify those issues that you want to have representation and buy-in, so that the police commission knows that it's supported. The police department. And then you want to have those issues where you leave the police department free to do its job day to day. And that is really what in my, law job, we call a question of institutional design. How do you design the institutions like a police commission, if that's what you did, or an inspector general's office, or the city council, whatever, to achieve that effort at perfection? Now, the specific question you asked me is, who do you put on the police commission and how do you pick them? That's the right question. That's the whole ball game at some level. And anywhere that I've been involved, there are very, very elaborate conversations about that, because everybody tries to peer into a crystal ball and guess how it's going to come out on the other end for what they care about based on what they're doing now. That's only natural, right? And it's interesting because there's this very, very famous legal philosopher, and I assure you I am not much of a legal philosopher, but there's this very, very famous legal philosopher, John Rawls, who had this idea that we should pick rules for society behind what he called a veil of ignorance, meaning we should actually pick rules not knowing anything about where we're going to sit or stand at the moment, but what would be kind of best in theory. And so, we went through this process in Chicago, and you can read the ordinance, and it's a very elaborate selection process. And it has lots of criteria for who should be on the commission. You need people with criminal justice experience. You need people who've been criminal justice system involved. You need youth. You need people from different areas of the city. I just happen to know that the mayor's office, which is right now picking commissioners from a slate provided by the city council, there's so many categories, it's hard to actually find people that fit in the categories. Like, you need to pick a system that's workable. So again, you want to be thoughtful about that. You want to look at other models. Should you decide to move toward a police commission or any of this, I think we at the Policing Project would be happy to help you think through it all. We don't go in with a lot of priors other than kind of what we've learned from experience, but we do have some expertise in institutional design to try to figure out something that works for your jurisdiction, that makes people feel like they're represented and that it's responsive, but also will actually work on the ground. It won't be so complicated that it just can't, we're about to have a commission appointed in Chicago, and we care deeply about it. We've been deeply involved from the beginning. And I've been in many conversations, with people of really different ideological views, and that's what's important, who uniformly want the commission to succeed. And whether it's city council, whether it's the mayor, whether it's a police commission, whether it's an inspector general, that's the right spirit, right? Which is that you go into it with people, no matter where they sit, thinking we want to design and get something working that's going to work for us so that we can be a safe city that is equitable and respectful of people's rights. And that's hard to do, but essential.
Thank you, Professor.
My pleasure.
I see that Tyler Adamson has his hand up. Tyler?
Hey, thanks for letting me ask some questions. One of the things I think about as a researcher, public health professional, epidemiologist is thinking about how data can inform the strategies we use and the solutions that we propose. And I think there are a lot of, as the conversation of policing has changed over the last, decades, but also particularly the last few years, a lot of the sort of standard solutions that we've thought of sort of have proven that they're not as effective as we may have thought. So I'm thinking of like bias training, and I think there is an argument for police-worn body cameras, but perhaps that is not that's not the only solution. So I'm curious to know, what sort of what data there is to inform what works well and what does not, both in terms of improvements, but also the models that have been utilized around the country, with the understanding that obviously every jurisdiction is different and has different needs, but if there's been some more than others that have proven more effective than not overall.
So
If that
glad
makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I'm really glad you asked the question, because it actually triggers me to say one thing that I think is super, super important, which I'll get to in just a minute. I'm going to start by just telling you, I too tend to come at things from a scientific bent. And before I worked on policing, I spent many years working on judging and the kinds of forces that affect how judges make their decisions and how you can design judicial institutions to get optimal decisions. And when I started to work in policing and I was writing my book, I asked my students to get me, some of the cost benefit literature and some of the social science on what works and what doesn't work. And they kept coming back and telling me there wasn't any. And I was like, you're not doing a very good job. Could you go back to the library and do it again? And eventually I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, which you can get your hands on, called something like, we spend $100 billion a year on policing and public safety, and nobody knows what works. The state of science around policing is appalling. It is startling to me that something that matters so much to every one of us, we know so little about. And one of our missions at the Policing Project is to try to help fix that. And so on the very specific thing that I think you're asking about, what does the literature say about what is an effective structure of governance for policing? There's basically not any. There's a little bit, but you are out there on the edge and having to try to, and one of the problems you face is that, let's get some people from LA to talk to us, or let's get some people from Chicago to talk to us, or Seattle. And I sat through some of those conversations in Chicago, and everybody's very proud of what they came up with for their city, and they want to come urge you to do the same thing. But there's much too little in the way of evidence to know what will work, let alone what will work for you. Now, I do want to contrast that with evidence about types of policing, because, for example, you're right that even though we're all in favor of, if we can only find anti-bias training and people don't want people to be biased, there's very little evidence that we've got any kind of training that actually achieves something. On the other hand, there is evidence about things like hotspot policing, what works and what doesn't. There's evidence about things like de-escalation training and what works and what doesn't. So even though I say it's in a deplorable state, there are things that I think we think we know. Your question leads me, though, to want to say something really important that I forgot. So transparency is essential. And way too few cities, whether it's the city council or the mayor's office or a police commission, demand from the police department the sort of transparency that there ought to be, just basic data. And I would be happy to share with you all, if you just bug me, we have both, we have a statute that we've drafted about transparency. We have a transparency framework that we use internally at the policing project. And then I ran a national project for the American Law Institute that wrote principles for policing. We just finished, and you had everybody in that room, from police chiefs and political officials, foundations, the Movement for Black Lives, NAACP, LDF, like everybody was in that room. And I'm actually super proud that over 5 years, like, we all got along incredibly well and made huge progress and had a lot of fun, except for the COVID part. And we have a principle about transparency. And there is just no reason on the planet that policing agencies don't provide a bunch of data for public release. Now, there are some things about policing that they can't make public. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like anywhere in government, there are things that you can't be fully transparent about. I understand that. But there's a lot of basic stuff you can. And one of the values of transparency, which I always stress to people, is, the more transparent you are, the healthier relationships you have. That's true in all of your individual lives, right? People don't trust you when you hide things from them. Now, I will tell you, one of the reasons that you don't get transparency from policing agencies is because often their information systems are just inadequate to the task. Like, this is a crisis in policing today, and it's one of the reasons that the science is so bad is we don't have the technology to develop, collect, process, information. For example, information easily about the demographic characteristic of traffic stops. So, but lots of other stuff. I mean, we have an initiative at the Policing Project to try to increase the number of women in policing. It's very hard to get data about who's recruited and who's interviewed and all of that. So I urge you, whatever you do, to take a look at transparency as part of your work and to mandate in some form that there be just better general transparency, because there's more trust, because people can help them solve problems. You just can't solve problems in the dark.
Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, good. I mean, a very good point on transparency. We've been joined by Senator Corey McCray, so I just want to make that note for our notes. Anyone else have questions?
Delegate Stephanie Smith has her hand raised.
Okay, great. Thank you,
Hi.
Delegate Smith.
I'm sorry I look like a hostage video. My lighting is not working well today, so my apologies. And I'm just thank you, sir, for taking your time, share your expertise with us. It's been really beneficial. Just to kind of I guess turn one of your observations inside out, like you were saying, it might have been Tyler's question too. Things like anti-bias training, things like that, they're kind of inconclusive in their merit of like what it really does to shift culture in these institutions. But I know there's been data from Homeland Security at the federal level, and then of course there's been press like the Philadelphia Police Department having to essentially discipline a large number of people for engaging in like active white supremacists, like either groups or, online portals or what have you. So I guess to me, there seems to be a national conversation about what does it look like to actually vet or assess if people already have either those like actual affiliations or leanings, because this is beyond I think like a casual observance. We have data to show that people with this type of orientation are systematically joining both the military and law enforcement to receive the training they may desire for other future things. And big cities are not immune.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's obviously a troubling one. I mean, I think and hope that everybody on this call aspires to have policing agencies that are profoundly respectful of all human beings. There's just no other way to think about the world. And I say that aware that I've spent enough time in police cars, believe me, to understand that first, I would not be a very good cop. It's a hard job, and second, it's a job that can, jaundice you in certain ways because you deal with a lot of social problems all the time that are very painful to see. And a lot of our work at the Policing Project right now is around reimagining public safety to try to figure out a way to either have alternative responders or co-responders, or at least to get people who call for help from the government the actual help they need to solve their problems. And so that's all important. Chapter 13 of our principles on policing from this American Law Institute project is all about the way there's 14 chapters. The first 12 are like, what are all the things you need to do to get policing on the best footing it can possibly be about? And there's a chapter on data collection, and there's a chapter on search and seizure, and there's a chapter on interrogation, and there's a chapter on forensics, all the things you might think. And then chapter 13 is what can the policing agencies themselves do to foster an environment of sound policing, which is what you're asking about. And chapter 14 is about what every other part of government can do, and not just government, but private entities, foundations, individuals. Don't call complaining that somebody is barbecuing somewhere just because they're Black. Like that, people should stop that. So, and chapter 13 might interest you just because it's all about things like hiring, firing, supervision, whatnot. And now it will disappoint you because like everybody really wants to know, how do you hire the best people to be police officers? I think everybody, police would like to know that. And again, we don't have enough data. But if you remind me, I'm happy to share the chapter. And there are people working on trying to know more about these things. But again, the science is not where we'd like it to be.
I have a question then. We know it's hard to perhaps recruit the people that are optimal in our mind, right? But do we have data on what attracts people to policing under the current paradigm? Why do they want to be police officers?
So, I don't have a good answer to that. It's a great question. I will tell you from my own work, I spent some time for a while looking at recruitment information. And this is a wild oversimplification, so I hope you will take it as exactly that. But there's recruitment I literally have, seen and read about recruitment materials that show police officers, rappelling from helicopters and, with all kinds of weapons and, I'm sure Mr. Cherry hasn't done a lot of rappelling from helicopters. It's not like the average thing that you do. And then there's recruiting materials that, show people, the kind that get you all choked up, even though that may not be accurate either for policing, but about, like patting the young kid on the head and helping them when they're hysterical about something. And I do think that, everybody's goal is to attract people who genuinely want to help people. Now, the nature of policing is that sometimes genuinely helping people means, weapons drawn and dealing with very, very fraught situations. And it's, it can be a dangerous job, and that's part of it. But helping people also involves just a huge amount of empathy for people that are living under very, very difficult circumstances that any of us would find challenging. And so that's hard. And it's not just about hiring, because I think doing the job every day and retaining the empathy is also hard. But those have to be our aspirations. And I will just say that whether it's the city council or the mayor's office or a police commission, if that's your focus, if you make that your focus, like, one of the things I care hugely about is officer wellness. The suicide rate is unforgivably high among police officers. Substance issues, unforgivably high among police officers. It's because it's a wildly stressful job and happening, most of us don't go to work at midnight and work through the night and have our schedules changed all the time and try to raise children doing all that. And so one advantage of some body that can actually handle all this, and I've urged the Chicago Police Commission to put way up at the top of their agenda, the executive director didn't have a commission yet, these officer wellness issues, because officer wellness issues make for healthy officers and healthy communities that the officers work in. And so that's the kind of issue that maybe it's hard for a city council to do, and maybe it's hard for a mayor's office to do. They're not impossible if they've got the right, deputy for public safety. But those are the kinds of broad issues where I do think we just don't pay attention enough to focus on what do we do to have healthy, well-functioning police departments.
I have a question as a follow-up to Delegate Smith, if possible.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So my question is in the same vein. Has there been any, data collected or provided, or in your work, have you seen any advantages to what we often hear as trying to recruit from the same neighborhood? So does that increase cultural competency? Does that have more positive outcomes? It gets discussed quite often, and so I'd just like to know your perspective on that.
Yeah, great question. So there is some data on that. I'm not an expert. I will tell you that the issue is more complicated than you might think. So cultural competency is super important. It's part of empathy. But very often, for example, people say, I really think the police should have to live in the neighborhoods that they police. But, that doesn't always necessarily get you the best police officers. Police officers are humans like everybody else. They want to pick the best place to live for them and their family at any given moment. Prices vary, conditions vary. So I know there's literature on there's some literature on recruiting, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert about it. But you did remind me, though, of one other quick thing I just wanted to mention, which you all are very aware of, but I think it's important to stress, which is, at the moment, you've got a consent decree and you've got a monitoring team that's trying to focus on a bunch of these issues. And frankly, I'd urge you, among other things, if you have questions like this, to get in touch with the monitoring team and ask them some questions, because they're in place right now under a federal court order to address some of these things, and they should address them. The other part of that, though, is they're going to go away at some point, or that's the plan. And that's one of the things you should be thinking about as you think through your work is, okay, so who then steps in lieu of a monitoring team to see that these really crucial issues are dealt with? And monitoring teams have advantages in the sense that there's a lot of expertise there, but they have huge disadvantages, including they are not democratically accountable to the city in any way whatsoever. And so the goal is to figure out how you can develop that expertise internally among a group of people to do that kind of work in a representative way. It hears from the community, but the police as well. Yep, sorry.
Sorry, no, I have a follow-up question on that, because so with Chicago and LA and Seattle even, who have these like pretty large offices to do that type of front end, at least data collection and providing recommendations and they're large cities, and Baltimore is a lot smaller. And I know even just like looking at the fiscal note for Chicago's structure, it's kind of expensive to have a team of experts doing that. We spoke to the St. Louis County Police Commission, and they're doing it with basically no funding or resources. And so just be curious to hear if you have seen cities that are that have these types of, you know, professional structures, have analysts who are doing that kind of work, but smaller cities, right? It's like, how would we be able to afford something like that?
Yeah. So, I'm just gonna make the obvious point that doesn't help, but that, you know, there's also not necessarily a relationship between size and wealth. There's some tiny jurisdictions that are really, really rich. So I don't think that things have to cost what they necessarily cost in larger cities. And one can be thoughtful about institutional design and streamline things so that it's workable and affordable. Those are all fair points, Haley. But I guess the challenge I would give you all is, you know, public safety is the fundamental thing. If you can't have places that are safe, you don't have good education, you don't have business development, you don't have so many things that follow from that. And you can't achieve public safety in the dark. You just can't do it. Places are trying. You know, now money doesn't guarantee you safety either. I mean, Chicago's pouring a lot of funding into this stuff, and the city's having the same challenges you're having. It's really difficult. But I think what you need to do is, yes, you have to be realistic. You couldn't be more right about that. And in designing, you should design from a sense of realism. Like, you know, I'm not going to say imagine the most amazing thing you can and then cut back where you need to. I mean, you need to go into it thinking about what the possibilities are. But I also think that, you know, this is where you have to spend some money, and you have to figure out how to spend it wisely. But it's not a luxury good. It's the most foundational thing.
Professor Adam from the Mayor's Office of Government Relations, can you talk a little bit about, so it's my understanding, and with Haley's research, we understand that I guess Chicago has been one of the major cities in recent years that have kind of underwent a similar exercise to what we're doing now, which is more of a reimagining of some of the basic structures of police oversight. Can you talk a little bit about that process of what went into the institutional design framework as you described it? Specifically curious about, you know, I know you've mentioned, and I love this term of like front end, a front end accountability, but you know, one of the things that we've been trying to struggle with is, you know, what does success look like, and what is that definition? And I know that you all have gone to extensive lengths of a structure that I think takes into account, you know, community input. And I know that, for example, you know, elected positions. Can you just talk a little bit about like how Chicago's model was designed? And I know it's still kind of being onboarded, but you know, very curious about what that process looked like.
Yes, it's a great question. I'd hoped to be here today with Nicole Jordan McBride, who works at the Policing Project, but didn't when I met her. She was chairing the Grassroots Alliance she was coordinating, not chairing, she was coordinating for the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability. That's how I met her, because I came to Chicago to talk about these things. And, you know, we all work really hard at our jobs, and most of what we do is just fine, but doesn't really make a difference. And every now and then we do something that really makes a difference. And I was really happy that one of the things in my life that I think made a difference was talking with that group about front end accountability, because I think it got them to shift from thinking about models that were all about back end and punishment and all of that to how do we design a system that works on the front end. And Nicole could tell you all about the inside of that at levels I can't, because she was running that coalition and I was not on the inside of all of it. I did eventually work with them and a team of people to design, for example, the framework and the statute. The process was incredibly comprehensive. They heard from lots of people. My own view is we actually ask communities for input too much at some level. Like, they're all exhausted from being asked for input and they want to see some results. But you have to get that right, because you need backup, you need political support for what you're going to do, and they had lots of it. I think some aspects of the ordinance, but I won't say which exactly, ended up a little catawampus, a little strange just because of the politics. Like we thought X made a great idea theoretically, but people weren't having any of it. Um, and so you do need a process that's inclusive enough that you hear what people can get excited about. Because I can say this, I honestly believe that when the police commission, it's Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability that went over the finish line, there was huge excitement about it. Everywhere, maybe not. I was really happy to hear from Mr. Cherry, because I think some in the police department were not happy, and we work really closely with the PD and with these communities. And I think they were wrong, because the commission could be their best friend in many ways. But when it went through city council, like I watched that hearing and the vote, and people were just so happy. And I think it was because there had been so much input, and everybody felt that they'd done a really good thing together. And there's a lot to be said for that. Madam Chair, I'm worried you saved yourself, or Madam Co-Chair, you saved yourself for last, and which is all to say that if we run out of time and you want to talk some other time, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goal is to get as many questions out as there are, and these questions have been good. I do need to go back to the very beginning and thank Haley Tilt for finding you and bringing you to this forum. Haley had a really good summer with, I want to say, Mayor's Office of Government Relations. I think she's getting ready to go back to school, or already is back in school, but I love that she's still here with us today and participating. So Haley, thank you for bringing Mr. Friedman to this forum. I do have a question, and if you can stay on just a few more minutes, that would be great. We will definitely circle back if not. But my question, you mentioned inspectors general, a couple of times, and Baltimore has a very strong independent inspector general program. It is moving towards even greater independence. That inspector general's office really serves the entire city enterprise. It is not an office that just takes cases from any entity. It's all city agencies, including the police department. I believe a couple of years ago, there was an inspector general housed right in the Baltimore Police Department. I don't believe that's the case any longer. But I wonder if you could just walk us through just a couple of steps of what you feel the role of an inspector general would be in terms of managing a police department or managing police issues.
So my dad was an IG, and I'm a believer in some entity that has the ability to get information and conduct independent investigations. And I'm a believer, again, because I think it does everybody good. Sometimes everybody's really mad at, I don't know, pick your favorite agency at the moment. And an IG comes in and finds out that, like, the agency's doing what they said, they're doing the right thing. And so an IG is yet another institution that can just create credibility. And I think we all know that we're living in a world right now that's a little scary in terms of its inability to agree on basic facts. And so I'm a fan. And as you point out, there are different models. I mean, LA's inspector general is part of the commission structure. Chicago's is separate, like you've described, but it has can't remember the title, but it's like a deputy who does public safety. So there are different structures, but at the bottom, they've got the power to get information. They've got the power to conduct investigations, and they have the power to issue public reports with recommendations. And that's kind of what they do. They just have the ability to learn, inform, and suggest. I know of IGs that can mandate, and I don't know that that would be a good idea. But anyway, I think that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. Our current inspector general structure, we have an inspector general office that has subpoena power, and they cannot mandate, they can strongly recommend. And I think the court of public opinion is where a lot of change happens. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah.
The other question or comment or area that I just wanted to go over very briefly, we do have a very, I say strong, well-established consent decree and a process and monitoring team. And I do see them in very real ways bringing a lot of the front end accountability that you've talked about. And there's more to come. They've been very structured in how they've gone about building that front end accountability. There is a concern that, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Others might feel different, but I think they're going to be with us for a little bit longer. And so I feel comfortable that we're going to keep making progress on front end accountability and then effectuating that. But you're right, at some point, there will be a strong desire for them to go on to their to the next city that they can serve. And I guess the question is, maintaining the progress on front end accountability, and how do we do that? We've talked about it some, in our small groups and as a larger group of, creating a structure that is built upon the very best aspects of that monitoring team and that consent decree process. One is the public role. I think that's really important. So what I thought was the question is more of a speech, but the question is, in your experience, looking at police departments across the state, the country that do have consent decrees, how have they maintained that front end accountability piece?
And some do and some don't. And so it's the right thing to be concerned about. And the consent decrees, I have mixed feelings about the monitoring process of consent decrees, and that's a topic for another day. But a successful monitoring team brings everybody together, because even the often police departments are in favor of them because they can't get resources that they need any other way than through a federal decree. And mayor's offices may not feel like they have the clout to get done what they need to do. And you get the dynamics, you've lived through them at a crazy level in Baltimore. But you want to maintain the forward progress. And I don't mean to be overly positive about police commissions, because I don't try to be overly positive about anything where we have no science. Seems like that should be a basic principle. And I wish we had more for you. I wish we had more to tell you about what works and what doesn't. But I think, and if you think about a commission or any mission, call it whatever you want, what you need the most are two things: expertise and representative credibility. So the first means people who understand the issues and can work with them, and the other means a body that the people of the city will look to and say, we trust them. And I know, for example, in Chicago, as they think through what might be the commission's agenda, and again, there are no commissioners yet, so nobody knows what the agenda will be. This is just conversation. But that everybody's thought is, how do we gain trust and respectability early? Because that's the secret to success. And it takes time to build that sort of thing, as you know, but partly by who you put on it, making sure that you have representation that makes people feel like they have a voice. In Chicago, I should just say this: Chicago is a very unique system, which I have a biased reason for favoring, though I was wildly against it at first. So I wasn't sure that elections for the police commission made any sense. And ultimately, they didn't go with elections. They went with a system where they have elected district councils in every district in the city, and then those district councilors nominate people to the police commission that the mayor will then pick from. So they're electing these district councils. And I had some worry about what the district councils were going to do and who was going to show up for the elections. Was anybody going to show up for the elections? You all know what that's like. It turns out that the district councils are super useful to us for our neighborhood policing initiative, because our neighborhood policing initiative depends on there being community ambassadors in every single district. And we have really worked hard to bring into the community ambassador coalitions, not just people who are friends of the police department, but people who didn't want to have anything to do with them. And these ambassador coalitions have been pretty successful. And the question was going to be, what happens when NYU goes away? And the answer is the district councils are going to take over this work. And so there was this entity that I wasn't sure it made sense to elect, but it turns out there's a purpose. governance is all about invention, as you know. So again, I think that if and when you get to that point, we'd be happy to help you think a little bit. My counterpart Maria's got huge experience with all this and a lot of views that don't always agree with my own. We disagree about a lot, but by puzzling through it, we figure out what looks like a right answer.
All right, thank you. In my limited experience, I have found that government and governance is all about being able to pivot and to be resilient and to really make the changes that need to be made to meet the moment that we're in. We always, you want to put things in place that have longevity and last, the proverbial forever, but that's just not realistic. I just did a quick scan of my notes, and a lot of the questions have come from the government side of this panel of the Local Control Advisory Board. As we slide into an hour and 15 minutes, I just wanted to see if there's anyone who is sort of got a community seat on this board who might have a question. Particularly, let me see if our co-chair Ashia Parker has any questions for you.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize for having my camera off most of the time. It seemed like I'm having bad internet. I'm just getting back in town, so everything is bad right this second. I'm trying to get acclimated back. But I have a question and maybe just advice that I'm seeking. So we're moving into the community outreach portion. We're focused on getting education out about the charter amendment that would allow us to have local control. Later on in the process, we're going to get feedback on possible models of local control from the community. Are there any things that you think that we should definitely get from the community while we're in this process? What is your advice as we move through the process? I'm kind of curious about how we can monopolize and get the best outcomes from doing these. I think we'll do up to like 5 or 6 meetings, and they'll be focused throughout Baltimore City. We'll also do some feedback portions as well as we conclude this process through December. So I would like just some of your feedback about how we can best go about the community feedback and education process.
Sure. Thank you for asking. And I have to run in a minute, but I'm happy to come back. I'm happy to talk to people individually. I care deeply about this, and I told Maria we should care because what cities are doing at the level that you're doing it is groundbreaking and essential, and I think is really the way to achieve public safety and support for an apparatus for public safety that everybody's happy with. Ashia, what I'm going to suggest the strongest to you is to talk to Nicole, because she ran this process. And there were actually 2 different grassroots groups that were opposed to each other, but at the very end came together on the bill that helped push it through council. And I think Nicole would be honest with you in terms of the good and the bad. So it was an overly convoluted process in some ways. I mean, one thing that worked was that there were a lot of individual groups that cared, that came together, and they had a very elaborate structure for holding meetings and getting input. And, it was a lot. It was probably too much at some level, but when you got to the finish line, everybody'd been heard and had a lot of process, and so it's fun to argue about that. I don't think everybody can go through that level of laboriousness, and so the challenge that you have is how to substitute for quite that level of laboriousness. And you put your finger on something, which is, like, I'm a huge advocate of hearing community views. I wrote a whole book about the concern that we be democratically accountable in terms of policing, but there's something unfair about that to communities too. Like, communities are full of people that are like just trying to put food on the table and get to work, and they haven't spent their time researching police commissions in different places or governance structures, and then you expect people to go to a meeting and just have opinions about that. Just like if you asked me to go to a meeting and talk about, nuclear power or something, like, I don't know. And so I think whatever you design, it would pay to come up with a set of materials and speakers that set the stage for people so that they understood and provided some learning and then got their feedback about the learning that you provided. That seems really, really important. Obviously credible messengers from the community who people trust, who can say, look, I don't have time to deal with this, but I trust you. You understand what matters to me, and you have spent time doing this. And I think that's really essential too. But I can't urge you enough to talk to Nicole, who couldn't be here today. because we had to move the time of this, and she's fantastic. She's a really special person.
Thank you. I'll reach out.
Okay, we're at 2:12. Doing a quick scan. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Natasha, you want to close us out? I think we're ready to conclude.
Sure. I do want to thank you very so much for your presentation. This has been extremely helpful for us. We're glad to connect, and if you don't mind, I'm sure we'll be in touch with additional questions and feedback as we continue upon our journey. And we'll certainly be in touch with Nicole, have her speak for Chicago, but we will be continuing to hear from other cities and people that could give us the necessary sort of information we need to help make those decisions in the future. And as Shia noted, we are beginning to do that community outreach, and we'll be getting into that in earnest in the next, actually starting this week, but for the next couple of months. So I do just, again, want to thank you for all this. And Chair, on that note, I will do a plug that Thursday at 6 o'clock,
Yes.
we have our first community town hall on the local control ballot measure. It will be in the Kern room. And I do want to thank the council president's team for their outreach and willingness to help, us cross our T's, dot our I's on getting things together. And I want to thank everybody for the feedback you've given on the slide deck. And so all of that has been very helpful. And even the stuff that has come in over the weekend and as of today, we're going to incorporate that in. And of course, we'll share it out with the group in advance of Thursday. But encourage everyone to attend. Or at least, let your community members know about the events and have them attend if they're interested. Again, this is the first of the meetings, so we will be going around the city to make it more accessible to everybody as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Friedman, thank you for giving us the time and then a little bit more. We appreciate it. I think we're leaving this session just a little bit better informed on sort of not just what to do, but how to do it in a really responsible and thoughtful way. So thank you very much. Thank you all of the LCAB board members that could be on and everyone else that supports our work. Hope to see everyone Thursday, 6 p.m. in person, City Hall, Curran Room. All right, thank you very much.
Everyone have a good day.
Thank you, Mark.